The courtroom went completely silent when Karen leaned toward Judge Judy, smiled as if the two women were old friends, and said, "You know, Your Honor, I have a feeling you and I are going to get along just fine." It was a strange thing to say in the middle of a lawsuit, but Karen did not seem embarrassed. She smiled wider. She adjusted her jacket, crossed one leg over the other, and gave the judge the kind of confident look usually reserved for someone being introduced at a private dinner, not someone defending herself in court. What Karen did not know was that Judge Judy had already noticed the small detail sitting beside the plaintiff. An old blue envelope. It looked ordinary. It was not. And by the time that envelope was opened, Karen's carefully polished charm would become the very thing that trapped her. Before this story goes any deeper, make sure you are subscribed for more unforgettable courtroom stories. And comment below where you are watching from, because this case was about to take a turn that nobody in that courtroom expected. The plaintiff sat quietly at the other table. Her name was Margaret Lawson. She was 64 years old, dressed in a simple gray cardigan with a small leather purse resting carefully against her chair. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. She had brought paperwork. Karen had brought confidence. And at first glance, confidence looked stronger. The case appeared simple. Margaret claimed Karen had taken a $4,800 deposit for a home renovation project, promised to complete the work, and then stopped responding after only a few days. Karen insisted that Margaret had changed the project. She claimed the older woman had become unreasonable. She claimed Margaret had misunderstood the agreement. And then Karen made her first mistake. She looked toward Judge Judy and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the smile of someone hoping to be understood. It was the smile of someone who believed she could control the room. Judge Judy watched her for several seconds. She did not smile back. That tiny moment mattered, because experienced judges learn something long before the evidence is finished. People reveal themselves in the way they behave when they think they are winning. Karen appeared relaxed, almost too relaxed. She leaned back in her chair whenever Margaret spoke. She sighed whenever the plaintiff mentioned a payment. And every few minutes, she glanced toward the courtroom audience as though she were silently inviting them to agree with her. Margaret never looked at the audience. She kept looking at the old blue envelope. That was the detail Judge Judy noticed. The envelope was worn along the edges. One corner had been repaired with transparent tape. Margaret kept one thumb pressed against it, as if she were afraid it might disappear. There was something deeply personal about the way she held it. But Karen did not seem interested. Instead, she began attacking Margaret's credibility. According to Karen, Margaret was confused about the timeline. Then she said Margaret was overreacting. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere. She has a habit of turning normal business problems into emotional emergencies. Margaret's fingers tightened around the envelope. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply lowered her eyes. And that reaction told Judge Judy more than Karen probably realized. This case was not just about $4,800. The money mattered, but it was not the deepest wound. Margaret had spent nearly 20 years living in the same small house. It had belonged to her late husband, Daniel. After his death, Margaret had promised herself that she would keep the place in good condition. Not because the house was valuable, but because every room carried a memory. The renovation was supposed to repair the damaged kitchen floor and replace several cabinets. Karen had presented herself as the perfect person for the job. She had photographs of previous projects. She had glowing testimonials. She spoke confidently about materials, schedules, and deadlines. And Margaret believed her. That trust was what made the dispute painful. Margaret had not simply handed Karen money. She had handed her something much harder to replace. Trust, the narrator of this fictional courtroom drama, could tell you that people often imagine deception begins with a lie. It does not. Sometimes it begins with confidence. Sometimes it begins with someone sounding so certain that the other person stops asking questions. Karen had understood that. She knew how to make people feel reassured. She knew when to smile. She knew when to compliment. And apparently, she believed she knew how to charm a judge. But Judge Judy was not watching Karen's smile. She was watching what happened every time Margaret mentioned the blue envelope. Each time the envelope appeared in the conversation, Karen's posture changed. Only slightly, her shoulders stiffened. Her smile disappeared for a fraction of a second. Then she recovered. Most people in the courtroom missed it. Judge Judy did not. People rehearse their words, the narrator observes. But they rarely rehearse what their bodies will do when the truth gets close. Karen continued explaining herself. She insisted the deposit had been legitimate. She insisted the unfinished work was Margaret's fault. She even suggested that Margaret had become difficult because of her age. That was when the courtroom became colder. Margaret finally looked up. There was no anger in her face. There was something quieter. Disappointment. Judge Judy looked at Karen, then at Margaret, then at the blue envelope. "Is there something in that envelope?" Judge Judy asked. Margaret hesitated. Karen immediately interrupted. "There really isn't anything relevant in there, Your Honor." The answer came too quickly. Judge Judy's eyes moved back to Karen. For the first time that morning, Karen stopped smiling. The courtroom remained still. The bailiff looked toward the judge. Margaret slowly placed the envelope on the table. She did not open it. Judge Judy did not reach for it either, not yet, because timing mattered. Karen had walked into the courtroom believing charm could make her look innocent. She had no idea that the one object she had tried to dismiss was about to become the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. And inside that old blue envelope was something Karen had apparently forgotten existed. Something with a date, a signature, and a sentence that could destroy the entire story she had just told the court. That was when Judge Judy leaned forward and asked Karen one simple question. And Karen's smile disappeared. Margaret Lawson had spent most of her life learning how to endure disappointment without making a scene. That was why Karen had misread her. Karen saw an older woman sitting quietly at a courtroom table and assumed quiet meant uncertain. It did not. Margaret had simply learned that some battles were not won by speaking louder. They were won by remembering everything. For nearly 20 years, Margaret had lived in the same modest house outside Columbus, Ohio, with the same narrow kitchen, the same faded curtains, and the same wooden cabinet where her husband Daniel used to keep his coffee mug. After Daniel died, Margaret had not changed much. She kept his photograph on the refrigerator, she kept his old watch in a drawer, and she kept the house almost exactly the way he had left it. The kitchen floor, however, had become a problem. Several boards had warped after a plumbing leak. One cabinet had begun pulling away from the wall. Margaret knew the repairs were necessary, but she had been putting them off. Then her neighbor recommended Karen Whitmore. Karen ran a small home renovation company called Whitmore Home Solutions. Her presentation was impressive. She arrived at Margaret's house with a tablet, a folder of photographs, and a confidence that made everything sound easy. She told Margaret the repairs would take less than 2 weeks. She gave her a written estimate. And when Margaret explained that she wanted the work done carefully because the house had belonged to her husband, Karen softened her voice. She told Margaret she understood. That sentence mattered, because Margaret later remembered it as the moment she stopped seeing Karen as a contractor and started seeing her as someone she could trust. The deposit was $4,800. Margaret paid it. A few days later, workers arrived. Then things changed. The wrong materials showed up. The schedule shifted. 2 workers stopped coming. And when Margaret began asking questions, Karen became less friendly. The same woman who had once spoken gently about Daniel's house began accusing Margaret of being difficult. Eventually, Karen stopped responding altogether. Margaret was left with an unfinished kitchen, An empty bank account where the deposit had been, and the humiliating feeling that she had somehow been foolish for believing someone. That was the emotional wound underneath the lawsuit. It was not simply the money. It was the realization that someone had studied her vulnerability and used it to make a sale. Judge Judy seemed to understand that, but she also knew something else. A courtroom could not operate on sympathy. Margaret needed evidence, and she had brought it. The first piece was a copy of the written agreement. It showed the total price, it showed the deposit, it showed the estimated completion date. Sybil. Important. But not enough. Karen had an explanation for every line. She claimed the agreement had changed after Margaret requested additional work. She claimed the delays were caused by Margaret. She claimed the unfinished portion was outside the original scope. On paper, Karen had constructed a reasonable defense. Then Margaret mentioned the envelope. She explained that after Karen stopped answering her calls, she had gone through the kitchen paperwork and found several items Karen had left behind. One of those items was a handwritten note. It was dated 3 days before the renovation began. Margaret had placed it inside the blue envelope because she was afraid she would lose it. Judge Judy looked toward Karen. Karen's expression had changed again. This time, it was harder to hide. She knew exactly what Margaret was talking about. And that was the first real crack. The narrator could see what was happening psychologically. Karen had spent the morning controlling the story. Every accusation had been carefully framed. Every answer sounded polished, but the blue envelope represented something she could not control. It contained words written before the dispute. Words written when Karen still believed no one would ever need to examine them. That was why Judge Judy did not rush. She allowed Karen to keep talking, and Karen kept making the same mistake. She explained too much. When someone feels secure in the truth, simple answers are usually enough. Karen needed paragraphs. She needed excuses. She needed Margaret to look confused. And when Margaret mentioned the handwritten note again, Karen leaned forward. "That note proves nothing," she said. Judge Judy looked at her. The courtroom became silent. Karen immediately added, it's just a personal note. It isn't a contract." That was technically true, but Judge Judy was no longer interested in whether the note was a contract. She wanted to know why Karen was so desperate to make sure nobody read it. Margaret slowly opened the envelope. Inside were several folded papers. One was a handwritten list of materials. Another was a receipt. And underneath them sat a small piece of lined paper with Karen's handwriting across the top. Margaret's hand trembled as she lifted it. She did not read it aloud. Judge Judy did. And the first sentence was enough to make Karen's entire posture change. The note did not discuss the renovation. It discussed Margaret. Karen had written it before the work began. And suddenly, the courtroom was no longer looking at a simple contractor dispute. It was looking at a plan that suggested Karen had known exactly how Margaret would react before the first worker ever entered the house. Karen's lawyer shifted in his seat. Karen stared at the paper. For the first time that morning, she looked less like someone defending herself and more like someone trying to remember what else she had left behind. Judge Judy placed the note on the bench. Then she looked directly at Karen. She still had not raised her voice. She still had not accused her of anything, but her next question was precise. "Why did you write that before the work even started?" Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The courtroom waited because the note had just changed the timeline, and if Karen's answer was what Judge Judy suspected, the $4,800 deposit was about to become the least important part of the case. The real question was no longer whether Karen had failed to finish a renovation. It was whether she had entered Margaret's home already knowing exactly what she intended to do. And that answer was buried in the next page of the blue envelope. Karen Whitmore had walked into the courtroom believing she understood the kind of person sitting across from her. Margaret was quiet. Karen was polished. Margaret had a worn purse and an old blue envelope. Karen had a professional folder, expensive-looking glasses, and the practiced confidence of someone who had explained away difficult questions many times before. But confidence becomes dangerous when it starts replacing preparation. Karen had built her business around making people trust her quickly. Her company was small, but she had learned how to make it look bigger. Her website featured photographs of renovated kitchens. Her social media pages were filled with smiling clients standing beside freshly painted rooms. Her online descriptions called her company a trusted partner for homeowners who demand excellence. Margaret had believed every word. What Margaret did not know was that Karen had developed a reputation among several former customers for something very different. She was excellent at getting deposits, less excellent at finishing difficult jobs. When customers complained, Karen had an explanation ready. A supplier had failed, a worker had quit, the customer had changed the design. The materials had become unavailable, the timeline had shifted. There was always another reason. And because most people did not want to spend months fighting over a contractor dispute, some simply accepted the loss and moved on. Karen had learned something from that. Most people did not pursue uncomfortable truths. Margaret did. That was her mistake. Or, more accurately, Karen's mistake was believing Margaret would not. When Karen entered the courtroom that morning, she carried the same confidence she used with customers. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her jacket was pressed, her documents were organized. She greeted the courtroom with a polite smile. Then she looked at Margaret. There was no apology in her expression. There was almost amusement. The narrator could see the difference immediately. Margaret looked like someone who wanted the truth settled. Karen looked like someone who wanted the performance finished. Judge Judy noticed it too. She watched Karen sit down. She watched her cross her arms. She watched her glance at the audience. Then she watched her look toward the blue envelope. For the first time, Karen stopped moving. Only for a second, but that second was enough. The note Margaret had already revealed was troubling. Karen had written that Margaret was easy to reassure and that she would probably accept a revised timeline if handled correctly. That alone suggested manipulation. But there was another sentence. One Karen clearly wished had never been written. Margaret's attorney lifted the page. Judge Judy read it again. The courtroom waited. Karen's lawyer leaned toward her and whispered something. Karen shook her head. She did not look at him, then she spoke. That was taken completely out of context. Judge Judy looked up. What context? Karen hesitated. The question was simple. She should have had an answer. Instead, she began explaining how the note had been part of a private planning document. She said she had been trying to understand Margaret's personality so she could communicate effectively. It sounded reasonable, almost. But then Karen made the mistake that would follow her for the rest of the hearing. She smiled, not the friendly smile from earlier, a smaller smile, a defensive one. The kind people use when they believe they have found a clever way around a difficult question. Judge Judy saw it. She did not challenge the smile. She challenged the timeline. If Karen had written the note before the renovation began, then she had formed an opinion about Margaret before Margaret had done anything wrong. That mattered. But there was still no proof that Karen intended to deceive her. The note created suspicion. It did not prove the entire story. Judge Judy needed more. So she returned to the basics, the deposit, the schedule. The materials, the communications, Margaret had saved every message. Karen had apparently forgotten that the first text was ordinary. Karen confirmed the project start date. The second message confirmed delivery of the materials. The third message was where the story began to change. Karen told Margaret the project would take longer. Then another message appeared. And another. Each one pushed the completion date further away. But there was something unusual. Karen had told Margaret that the delays were caused by missing materials. The receipts showed the materials had already been purchased. That created the first serious contradiction. Judge Judy looked at Karen. Karen had an answer. She said the receipts did not prove the materials had actually arrived. That was fair. But Margaret had another document, a delivery confirmation, signed, dated. And attached to the original order, the evidence was beginning to form a ladder. First came the agreement, then the payment, then the messages, then the delivery record. None of them alone destroyed Karen's story. Together, they began making her explanation harder to believe. But the blue envelope still contained one more item, and Karen knew it. Her hands were no longer folded. They were gripping the edge of the table. Her lawyer noticed. So did Judge Judy. The psychological shift was unmistakable. Karen had entered the courtroom controlling the emotional atmosphere. Now she was reacting to it. That reversal often happens when someone realizes the room is no longer accepting their version automatically. A person who feels secure answers questions. A person who feels trapped starts managing impressions. Karen began doing exactly that. She reminded Judge Judy that she had many satisfied customers. She mentioned her years in business. She referred to positive reviews. She explained that she had never intentionally harmed anyone. But none of those statements answered the question, what happened to Margaret's money? And why had Karen written about Margaret before the work began? Judge Judy let the silence remain. Then she asked Karen something even more specific. Did you write that note? Karen looked down. Her attorney touched her arm. She looked back at Judge Judy. Yes. One word, the courtroom became still. Judge Judy continued. And you wrote it before you received the deposit. Karen swallowed. Yes. Another pause. Then Judge Judy asked the question that made Karen's confidence crack. Then, why did you already have a strategy for dealing with Margaret's objections? Karen's lips parted. She looked toward her lawyer. He did not answer. For several seconds, nobody moved. Margaret stared at the table. She was not smiling. She was not celebrating. She simply looked relieved that someone had finally asked the question she had been unable to put into words. But Karen still had one defense left. She claimed the note was being misunderstood. She insisted it did not mean what everyone thought it meant. And for a moment it appeared she might survive that explanation. Then Judge Judy reached toward the blue envelope. Not quickly, not dramatically. Almost casually, she pulled out the final sheet of paper. Karen saw it. Her face changed immediately because this was not another text message. It was not another receipt. It was something Karen had never mentioned. A second agreement signed by Karen and dated 2 days before Margaret's contract. Judge Judy looked at the signature. Then she looked at Karen. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing because suddenly the question was no longer whether Karen had failed Margaret. The question was who Karen had promised the same money to before Margaret ever entered the picture. And that document was about to reveal why Karen had been so determined to charm the judge from the moment she walked through the door. The second agreement landed on the courtroom bench like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke. Karen stared at the document. Her attorney leaned closer. Margaret did not move at all. Judge Judy looked down at the signature, then back at Karen. The document was dated 2 days before Margaret had signed her renovation agreement. It was an agreement between Karen Whitmore and a supplier for the same kitchen materials Karen had claimed were unavailable. The supplier had received a substantial payment, and the payment had been made before Margaret's deposit ever reached Karen's account. The contradiction was immediate. Karen had told Margaret the project was delayed because the supplier had failed to provide the materials, but the document showed Karen had already paid for them. So Judge Judy asked a question that sounded almost too simple. Where were those materials? Karen blinked. They were delayed in transit. Judge Judy looked back at the document. The supplier says they were delivered. Karen's attorney shifted again. Karen looked toward him. He said nothing. That silence told the courtroom something. Karen had been performing certainty all morning. Now she was searching for it. Judge Judy did not raise her voice. She simply placed the document beside the other evidence, one piece, then another, then another. The proof ladder was becoming a wall. The original agreement established the deposit. The bank record established that Karen received it. The delivery confirmation established that the materials arrived. The messages established that Karen told Margaret the materials had not arrived. And now the second agreement suggested something even more troubling. Karen had already been moving money around before Margaret ever complained, but Judge Judy was not finished. She looked toward Margaret. "Did Karen ever tell you the materials had arrived?" Margaret nodded. "She told me they were coming. Did you see them?" "No." "Did anyone from her company show you proof of delivery?" "No." Judge Judy turned back toward Karen. Karen's confidence had almost completely disappeared. Then Karen made another attempt to regain control. "Your Honor, this is being made to sound much worse than it was." The courtroom became quiet again. Judge Judy looked at her. Karen continued. "It was a business decision. I had expenses. I had employees. I had other projects." There it was, not a confession, but something close to its explanation for why the money had moved. Judge Judy asked, "Other projects?" Karen nodded. "Yes. Were those projects paid for by Margaret's deposit?" Karen hesitated. "No." The answer came quickly, too quickly. Judge Judy looked down at the bank record. Then she looked up. "Then explain this withdrawal." Karen froze. The bank record showed a transfer from the account where Margaret's deposit had been received. The money had moved 3 days after the payment. It had not gone to a supplier. It had not gone to a worker. It had not gone toward Margaret's kitchen. It had gone into another account connected to Karen's business. Karen's lawyer stood slightly. "Your Honor, there can be accounting explanations." Judge Judy stopped him with one look. The courtroom fell silent. Karen's face had changed. She was no longer charming. She was calculating. And that difference mattered. The narrator could see it clearly. Charm works when people are still deciding whether to trust you. Once the evidence begins contradicting your story, charm becomes a liability. Karen had spent the first half of the hearing trying to make everyone feel comfortable. Now every smile looked rehearsed, every gesture looked calculated, and every explanation created another question. Judge Judy reached for the blue envelope again. This time she removed a small handwritten receipt. Margaret recognized it immediately. Karen did too. It was a receipt Margaret had received after handing over the deposit, but beneath the printed amount was a handwritten sentence. Karen had written it herself. Margaret had kept it because she thought it was simply a note confirming what the deposit covered. Judge Judy read the sentence. Then she looked at Karen. The room became completely still. The handwritten note stated that the deposit would be used exclusively for materials and labor connected to Margaret's renovation. Karen had just spent nearly an hour explaining why she had been entitled to use the money differently. The document contradicted her, and then came the question that finally broke the performance. "Why did you write exclusively?" Karen stared at the bench. No answer. Judge Judy waited. 5 seconds. 10. Karen finally whispered that she did not remember writing it. Margaret looked down. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She had not wanted revenge. She had wanted an explanation. And now the courtroom was beginning to understand that she had never received one. But there was still something missing, the hard proof, the evidence that could establish what Karen had actually done after receiving the money. Judge Judy looked toward the courtroom monitor. She asked whether the bank records included transaction details. They did. And one transaction stood out. A payment had been made from Karen's business account to a company called North Star Event Group. Karen's lawyer immediately objected. "That has nothing to do with this renovation." Judge Judy looked at the document. Then she looked at Karen. "That's what I am trying to determine." Karen shook her head. "It was unrelated." Then why was it paid from the account containing her deposit? Karen had no immediate answer. The lawyer leaned toward her. She whispered something. Judge Judy watched them. Then she noticed Karen's hand. Her fingers were trembling. For the first time all morning, Karen looked frightened. Not embarrassed, not annoyed, frightened. And that distinction changed everything. Because Judge Judy now suspected the renovation was only one piece of the story. She asked for the transaction details. The courtroom waited. The clerk pulled up the record. The payment date appeared on the screen. It was the same day Margaret had asked Karen why nobody had returned to her house. The amount was $2,900, and the description attached to the payment contained 3 words: event deposit. Margaret looked confused. Karen's face went pale. Judge Judy read it again. Then she looked at Karen. Why was your renovation company's money paying for an event? Karen opened her mouth. Nothing came out. The courtroom had reached the point where explanations were no longer enough. Something had been hidden, something much larger than a delayed kitchen renovation. And now the evidence was pointing towards a second business, a second account, and a pattern Margaret had never known existed. If you think you already know where this case is going, comment justice below. Because the next document was the one Karen never expected Judge Judy to find. Judge Judy opened the final page of the financial records, and at the top was a name, not Margaret's, not Karen's. A name belonging to another homeowner. Then another transaction appeared, and another, and another. The courtroom finally understood why Karen had been so eager to charm the judge. Margaret's $4. $800 was not sitting alone in that story. It was part of a pattern. And the blue envelope had just opened the door to all of it. The name on the financial record was Elizabeth Parker. Then came another, Thomas Reed. Then another, 3 separate homeowners, 3 separate deposits, 3 separate renovation projects. And all 3 payments had passed through the same business account Karen had used for Margaret's money. Judge Judy looked at the records without saying a word. Karen stared straight ahead. The woman who had entered the courtroom smiling was gone. What remained was someone trying desperately to calculate how much of the truth had already been uncovered. The financial trail showed a disturbing pattern. Customers paid deposits. Projects began. Then the work stalled. Karen blamed suppliers. She blamed customers. She blamed scheduling problems. But the money did not simply disappear. Some of it moved between accounts. Some went toward unrelated business expenses. And at least one payment had been connected to the event company Judge Judy had just discovered. Margaret sat completely still. She had spent weeks wondering whether she had somehow caused the entire problem. Now she was realizing something painful. She had not been the only one. Judge Judy asked for the records involving Elizabeth Parker. The clerk brought them forward. Elizabeth had hired Karen 4 months before Margaret. Her project had also stopped before completion. Her deposit had also been disputed, and her complaint contained almost the exact same explanation Karen had given that morning. Customer changed the scope. The courtroom went quiet. Margaret looked toward Karen. Karen did not look back. That was when Judge Judy said something that changed the emotional weight of the entire hearing. This is not a misunderstanding. She placed the documents together. It is a pattern. Karen's lawyer objected. He argued that the other customers were not parties to the case. Judge Judy agreed. But she was not using those records to decide whether Karen owed those people money. She was using them to understand whether Karen's explanation to Margaret made sense. That distinction mattered, and Karen knew it. The narrator could almost see the moment she realized that her polished story was collapsing under its own contradictions. Then Judge Judy returned to the blue envelope. She pulled out the handwritten note again. This time, she read the entire sentence. It was not simply about Margaret being easy to reassure. It described what Karen intended to do if Margaret became difficult. She would delay. She would offer a small concession. She would tell Margaret the materials were coming, and if Margaret threatened to complain, Karen would remind her that older homeowners usually don't want the hassle of taking things further. Margaret lowered her head. The sentence hurt more than the money. Karen had not merely underestimated her. She had categorized her. She had looked at Margaret's age and assumed it made her easier to manipulate. Judge Judy looked at Karen. "You wrote this before you met her?" Karen whispered, "Yes." "Why?" Karen had no answer. The courtroom waited. Finally, she said, "I was frustrated with difficult customers." Judge Judy shook her head. "That doesn't answer the question." Karen looked down. Her confidence was gone. Then Margaret reached into her purse. She pulled out a small photograph. It was a picture of her kitchen, not after the renovation. Before it, Daniel was standing beside her in the photograph, smiling beside the old cabinets. Margaret explained that she had taken the picture the morning before Karen's first visit. She had wanted to remember what the kitchen looked like before the work began. The photograph itself was not powerful evidence, but on the back was something Karen had never seen: a date. And underneath it, Margaret had written, "Daniel would have liked this." Her voice broke slightly. She continued anyway. That sentence explained why the unfinished kitchen had hurt so much. Margaret was not fighting for a perfect renovation. She was trying to preserve the last part of her home that still felt connected to her husband. Karen had treated it like another transaction. That was the deeper betrayal. The narrator could feel the courtroom changing. The case had begun as a dispute over $40,800. Now everyone understood what Margaret had actually lost. She had trusted someone with a place filled with memories, and Karen had treated that trust as a weakness. But the strongest proof had not appeared yet. Judge Judy turned back to the financial records. One transaction remained, a payment of $1,750. It had been sent from Karen's business account to North Star Event Group. The description said event deposit, but the date was important. The payment had been made the same week Karen had told Margaret she could not afford to return her deposit. Judge Judy asked Karen what the event was. Karen hesitated. Then she said it was a private business function. Judge Judy asked whether the event was connected to her renovation company. Karen said no. Judge Judy asked why the renovation account had paid for it. Karen said the accounts were sometimes used interchangeably. That answer was almost enough to destroy the last piece of her defense, because earlier Karen had said Margaret's money had never been used for anything unrelated to the project. Now she was admitting that the business accounts were mixed. Judge Judy looked at her. "Then how do you know her money wasn't used?" Karen froze. There was no clever answer, no smile, no compliment. No explanation about customer misunderstandings, just silence. The courtroom felt the power shift completely. Karen had spent the morning trying to charm Judge Judy. But charm could not answer a bank statement. Judge Judy asked for one final document, a transaction history covering the period beginning with Margaret's deposit. The clerk brought it forward. Karen's lawyer looked at the pages. His expression changed. He knew. Judge Judy turned the first page, then the second, then the third, and there it was. A transfer made less than 24 hours after Margaret's payment. The amount was $4,800, exactly the entire deposit. It had been moved out of the renovation account, and the destination account was not Karen's supplier. It was another account controlled by Karen. The courtroom became silent. Margaret closed her eyes. Karen stared at the document. Judge Judy asked one final question. "Why did you move her entire deposit the day after she paid you?" Karen's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Then she whispered, "I don't remember." Judge Judy looked at the document again, then at Karen. The evidence had finally reached the point where memory was no longer a defense. Karen's charm had failed. Her explanations had failed. Her timeline had failed. And now the financial record had contradicted the story she had told from the beginning. But Judge Judy had one final piece of information, a phone recording. Margaret had saved a voicemail Karen left 2 weeks after the renovation stopped. In the voicemail, Karen sounded completely different. There was no polished customer service voice, no reassuring smile, no careful explanation, just one sentence that Margaret had never understood until that moment. Judge Judy played the recording. Karen's own voice filled the courtroom. And the sentence was enough to expose what had been hidden behind the entire dispute. The courtroom listened. Karen's face turned pale. Margaret looked toward the judge. And Judge Judy finally understood why Karen had been so determined to charm her from the beginning. Karen had known there was something on that recording. She had simply believed nobody would ever play it in court. Now the recording was about to be heard by everyone, and when it ended, there would be nowhere left for Karen to hide. The courtroom listened as Karen's recorded voice came through the speakers. Her tone was different from the woman who had spent the morning smiling at Judge Judy. There was no charm in it, no carefully chosen words, no polished explanation, just frustration. Karen had called Margaret after the renovation stopped, and in that voicemail she had said something Margaret had never understood. She told Margaret that if she kept pushing, she would make sure the situation became much more expensive and difficult than the deposit. The recording ended. Nobody moved. Margaret stared at the table. Karen closed her eyes. Judge Judy sat completely still. The voicemail did not prove every allegation by itself, but combined with the documents, the timeline, the financial records, and Karen's own admissions, it changed the meaning of everything that had come before it. The threat was no longer an isolated sentence. It fit the pattern. First came the promise, then the deposit, then the delay, then the explanation, then the attack on Margaret's credibility. And finally, pressure designed to make Margaret stop asking questions. The narrator could see the psychological reversal. Karen had entered the courtroom believing Margaret was the vulnerable person. But Karen had underestimated something more powerful than money, mirror. Margaret had saved everything. Every seat, every message, every date, every document. Even the old blue envelope Karen probably thought was worthless. That envelope had preserved the timeline Karen had spent the entire hearing trying to rewrite. Judge Judy turned toward Karen. Karen no longer looked at the audience. She no longer smiled. She no longer tried to charm the judge. She simply sat there. Judge Judy reviewed the financial evidence one final time. The $4,800 deposit had been transferred out almost immediately. The materials Karen claimed were unavailable had been delivered. The handwritten note showed Karen had already planned how to handle Margaret's objections. The records showed similar disputes with other customers, and the voicemail showed that when Margaret refused to disappear quietly, Karen attempted to intimidate her. The visible case had begun with a renovation. The real case was about trust. It was about what happens when someone discovers that another person treated their vulnerability as an opportunity. Judge Judy finally spoke. She explained that the evidence did not support Karen's version of events. The $4,800 would be returned. Additional damages were awarded for the documented financial loss connected to the failed agreement. The matter involving the other customers was separate, but the financial records and recording were serious enough that the relevant information would be preserved for further review. Karen's lawyer lowered his head. Karen stared at the bench. For once, she had nothing to add. Then Judge Judy delivered the line that would become the moment everyone remembered. Charm can open a door, but it cannot erase the footprints you leave behind. The courtroom remained silent for a second. Then Margaret exhaled. It was a tiny sound, but it carried the weight of weeks of uncertainty. She did not celebrate. She did not turn toward Karen. She simply placed her hand on the old blue envelope, the same envelope Karen had dismissed, the same envelope that had carried the note, the receipt, and the documents that reconstructed the truth. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. But this time, they were not tears of humiliation. They were tears of relief. She had spent weeks wondering whether she had been foolish. Now she knew she had not imagined what happened. Someone had simply counted on her being too tired, too polite, or too embarrassed to challenge it. She had challenged it, and she had brought the evidence. Outside the courtroom, the story did not become a national scandal. It did not need to. Within days, two other former customers contacted the appropriate authorities after learning that their situations appeared to share similarities with the records presented in court. The renovation company faced additional scrutiny. Customers who had once praised Karen began asking questions, and the confidence that had once made Karen appear untouchable became the very thing people remembered. Because the courtroom footage of the fictional case circulated online, viewers focused on one particular moment. Not the verdict, not the money, the blue envelope. People wanted to know why Margaret had kept it. The answer was simple. She had kept it because she believed every piece of paper might matter someday. And she was right. 3 days after the hearing, Margaret returned home. The kitchen was still unfinished. But it no longer felt like a symbol of defeat. She hired another contractor. The repairs eventually continued. And one small detail remained unchanged. Daniel's photographs stayed on the refrigerator. The house did not become perfect. It became hers again. That was the part Karen had never understood. She believed she was fighting over a deposit. Margaret was fighting to reclaim control over a piece of her life. And there is a reason this fictional case stays with people, because the most powerful evidence was never the loudest evidence. It was an old envelope, a receipt, a date, a signature, a recorded voice, small things. Ordinary things, the kinds of things people overlook when they believe they can control the story. Karen had walked into court thinking she could charm Judge Judy. She smiled. She complimented. She performed confidence. But Judge Judy never needed to compete with Karen's charm. She simply waited for the evidence to speak, and when it did, the performance ended. That is the lesson buried inside this case. Truth does not always arrive with a dramatic entrance. Sometimes it sits quietly inside a purse. Sometimes it is folded inside an old envelope. Sometimes it is saved on a phone because someone was afraid nobody would believe them later. And sometimes justice begins when an ordinary person refuses to throw those things away. Margaret did not defeat Karen by becoming louder. She defeated the story Karen had created by remembering the truth more carefully than Karen remembered her own lies. The courtroom had begun with a woman trying to control the judge's impression of her. It ended with the judge controlling the facts, and that difference changed everything. If this case reminded you that truth still matters, subscribe for more courtroom stories where arrogance finally meets accountability. Like this story, share it with someone who believes small details do not matter. And comment below, if you had been Margaret, would you have kept that old blue envelope?